Welcome to Empowering Homeschool Conversations, your authority in navigating the world of homeschooling diverse learners. Featuring Peggy Ployhar from SPED Homeschool, Annie Yorty from AnnieYorty.com, Leilani Melendez from Living with Eve, Stephanie Buckwalter from eLARP Learning, and Dawn Jackson from Dawn Jackson Educational Consulting and Tutoring. With over 75 years of combined homeschooling expertise, experiences, and perspectives, this group is eager to share their wealth of wisdom to empower your homeschooling journey. So grab your favorite mug, settle in, and get ready for insightful discussions, valuable insights, and practical tips. Give your homeschool the power boost it needs to successfully educate the unique learners in your home.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Empowering Homeschool Conversations. Today, we are going to talk about unlocking literacy, empowering kids with disabilities to read. And my guest today is Stefanie Hohl. She has been teaching children to read for years. She holds advanced degrees in both children's literature and early childhood education, and she has experience running preschools, homeschools, and local storytime programs. Stefanie developed the ABC See, Hear, Do, Learn to Read method to make learning, early learning, fun and easy for kids and their parents. Stefanie lives in Pittsburgh with her husband, 5 children, and 2 very silly dogs. Maybe we'll hear a little bit about those dogs too. Well, welcome, Stefanie, to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me today.
Absolutely. So we are going to talk about reading, which I know a lot of parents really struggle with. I struggled with it. I didn't even know what the word phonics was when I started homeschooling. And so the whole process of reading, I just thought, well, people just learn to do that. And I didn't realize, as a very uneducated educator, that there's processes involved with that. And so people like you that write curriculum and that have background are just a wealth of information to our community, because I think the more information we have and the more that we can learn what supports are out there, the less intimidating it feels for us, especially when we have a child that struggles and we kind of feel like, what do I do? How do I even approach this? And so I'm excited to have this conversation with you today on that. Let's just set the stage a little bit for this conversation, because I want parents to realize, first of all, they're not alone. And these maybe are common things that other people deal with. But why can this process of learning to read be especially challenging for some learners?
So
I think parents kind of go, yeah, my child can't be, it's just hard. So yeah, I'll let you go.
Yeah. And a lot of people like you think that learning to read should be something that just comes naturally, that, kids learn to speak they just pick it up by us speaking to them. And I think a lot of parents think that it's going to be the same for reading, but that's really not the case. Learning to read is a very complex process, and it takes a lot of steps, and it takes a lot of years. And children can have difficulties with each different step. So while they might understand that C says k, they might not be able to blend that with other sounds, or they might not be able to decode, or they might not be able to process it fast enough. There's so many factors that go into learning to read that it can just be really challenging. The parents are definitely not alone. It's actually quite frightening, the numbers of kids that struggle to read by 4th grade. About 60% of kids are struggling with reading. It's
really?
A big problem. Yeah. So parents are definitely not alone. If their kids are struggling, that's actually more the norm than
wow.
not. So, yeah, learning to read is a very difficult process.
Yeah. I've had guests on before talk about that too. And it's nice to know that it wasn't just, because I think a lot of times we turn and just say, well, it was just, how I taught or the curriculum or my child. There's so many things to blame it on, but there's so many steps involved, and there could be a plethora of things at every step, like you're saying, that could be missing the boat. And so yeah, it's not as easy as just like one place to point your finger to
Right,
and be
right.
done with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, but what are the obstacles that children can be challenged with when they're approaching reading?
Um, well, there's many things and a lot of technical things that I'm not going to get into all of
Yeah.
those. And there, obviously, there's things like dyslexia, which is often very underdiagnosed, and that
Hmm.
can appear in a lot of different ways. A lot of people just think it's like
Oh.
flipping letters, but it actually involves
Hmm.
other processing skills as well. Um,
Oh.
so there's things like that, but then there's also just challenges of connecting sounds to the letters, um, the challenge of being able to fluently blend the sounds together to read a word. Sometimes
Okay.
can blend the sounds together to read a word, but then by the time they're done doing that, they can't connect what that word means. So they might be able to like say the word, but that doesn't
Wow.
mean they're actually
Hmm.
understanding the word they're reading. Um,
Hmm.
Sometimes that's a challenge. And then another problem with is that is just frustration often. Kids feel
Oh. Hmm.
that reading is too hard, so they don't want to do it or they give up.
Hmm.
And often it's because they're given books that are just way too hard for them. And so then they think, oh, I can't do that. I can't read.
Right.
And so then they don't want to try
Hmm.
because it's something that they just get frustrated with or they fail at, and then they don't want to do it anymore. Um,
Absolutely. All of us are that way,
right,
when whatever we're faced with, we're like, I'm just not good at that. And I think we live in a society that everything should happen instantly. At least we're kind of led to believe that. And then so if we don't do it well, then we must not be good at it. But there's so much involved in
right,
persistence, and a child can only persist for so long without
right.
feeling like they're a
And
failure.
because learning to read does require so many steps and take so long, I think parents and teachers and educators often think, "Oh, they can blend a word together. They got it. Here's a book. Read this." And it's like,
Right.
"No, no, no, they're not ready for that yet." Um,
Hmm.
and so it just builds the frustration. So that
Right.
being said,
And
there
is that how, like, traditional methods, for teaching reading, are kinda set up that when a child hits a certain skill, that then they're just given a certain thing to do, and then that's where the failures fall in, or how does that kind
well,
of lead to?
so traditional methods of teaching reading are usually they're just focused on visual and auditory methods. It's like, uh,
Hmm.
there's been battles over the years about phonics or not phonics. It's
Right.
been proven that phonics is absolutely the best way to learn reading. Um, but often it's like, sit down, you're going to learn this, and we're going to go through this. And it's often boring and difficult and um, just not fun. And so
Right.
it just often doesn't suit kids that don't learn well in that way.
Hmm.
There's kind of just been this like one way, like you're gonna learn to read like this. And if you have the
Yeah.
kid that learns like that, that's great and it works. But for those of us that have kids that maybe learn a little differently, it's a
Mhm.
real challenge when those traditional methods just aren't working very well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so they focus on one pathway basically, and if you don't match that pathway, then good luck, and or we'll stick you in a special program, and you may get a little more
Yeah.
help, but still sticking with those. Did most of those specialized programs still stick with that same method like hmm, just delivery of content?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other issue with traditional reading methods is that there's this big gap between, okay, you have phonics, and a child can maybe understand that the A says ah and the C says k, but there's this big gap between understanding a letter makes a sound and learning how to blend those sounds together.
Oh,
And
okay.
and people just assume that as soon as a child understands the sounds, that they're going to be able to put those sounds together to read a word. But there
Hmm.
isn't really a lot of instruction of how to do that. Um,
Right.
and that is its own skill. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's important to kind of break this learn to read process into these little baby steps so that the child
Yeah.
can be confident and be successful
Right.
the entire time.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. But it, a lot of us who, know nothing about this whole process of, all those steps and what is the prerequisite skills for other things, it can be very confusing. And I know you have a background in this, but also you have a personal story that led to the development of your curriculum. I would love for you to share that and just how your approach is so different from what other curriculums that you saw that were out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, I have 5 kids, and
Mhm.
my oldest is 20 now. So I taught her to read eons ago, back before I knew anything about teaching kids to read. So I was just like
Yeah.
you and everyone else. I did not know anything back then, and so I just used whatever a friend had recommended. Um,
Mhm.
And it didn't go very well with her, and she
Hmm.
actually ended up hating reading, and I was like, "I've
Oh,
ruined my
wow.
child forever." Um, and that was a big struggle, and so then my next 3 boys, I still didn't really have any other resources, and I was like, "Well, I don't know what else to do." So I used the
Mhm.
same traditional methods, and for them, it worked better. They just were their personalities were more suited for it,
Huh.
and they learned to read. I mean, it wasn't fun, but we did it, and
Right. Yeah.
it was fine. And then I had my youngest child who he was just a whole new ballgame. Um,
Uh,
he wouldn't sit still. He wouldn't listen to me. He was
mm,
very defiant. He was not interested in books or learning or
mm.
anything. I was like, I was just like, I don't even know where to begin with him. Like, none of
Right.
these methods I used for my other kids are going to work. Like, I just know it's going to be a fight and a disaster,
Mhm.
and he's going to hate reading. And I really didn't want that. Um,
Yeah.
and so at the time, I was actually in my grad school program, my master's of education in curriculum and instruction. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to dive into teaching kids to read for one of my classes for a research project. And so
Hmm.
I started doing a deep dive into research about methods of teaching reading because I was like, there's got to be something else out there.
Right.
And I had actually seen one of my older kids' preschool teachers use a method that used movement to teach reading. And
Hmm.
I was like, that's genius. And I was like, there's got to be something like that. But that method was designed specifically for like a classroom use. And I was
Okay.
really looking for something that a parent could just pick up and use with their
Mhm.
child. Um, and I just couldn't find anything.
Hmm.
And um, at the time, I was also trying to become a children's book author. And so kind of all my worlds collided. And
Yeah.
I just decided, well, I'm just going to design my own program that fits my son and what he needs.
Hmm.
Um, and I did that, and I tested out a bunch of different things. And then I ended up adding movement and doing that. And I tried it with my son. It was right before his 4th birthday, and it clicked. And it was like
Wow.
magic. I started crying, and I was like,
Oh.
this is amazing. Like, hearing him read his first word when I thought it was going to be just impossible, and he was,
Hmm.
happy and having fun with it. And that's when I was like, I'm onto something here, and this is something I have
Hmm.
to share with other parents. Um, because it
Yeah.
just made the learn to read process so much easier and more fun.
Yeah. That's amazing. And um, how inspiring that, yeah, like you said, all your worlds collided, and yet at the same time, it helped your child that was really struggling, and that's encouraging for all of us. Um, so so multisensory, kind of explained to us, how does that open doors that wouldn't be opened with traditional methods?
Right. So, because learning to read is such a complex process, it uses a lot of different parts of your brain for each process.
Hmm.
And when you use traditional methods of teaching to read, you're really only accessing visual and auditory, those parts of your brain. So, when you add in movement and multisensory things,
Hmm.
you're really unlocking other parts of the brain. And the
Yeah.
more parts of the brain you use and access, the
Hmm.
more like neural pathways it creates, which allows different types of learners to learn much more easily and to retain it much more easily because there's more parts of their brain firing um,
Right.
and being
Yeah.
accessed. And
Hmm.
so, um, and kids especially are naturally kinesthetic learners. They're
Hmm.
always moving, they want to be moving.
Right.
Um, And so not only does adding in that multisensory movement make learning like more fun and engaging,
Hmm.
it actually increases learning by 90%. Like
Wow.
the research on this is huge. Like that is a
Hmm.
big, big difference. Um,
Yeah.
and so it just makes it click for a lot of kids. It's like that missing
Hmm.
piece that really just seals the deal.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, it that's just amazing, and yet the fact that we don't do it, and I know because a lot of curriculum is created for a classroom environment, and if you had kids moving in every direction, it would be very difficult in a classroom setting. But what an advantage we have as homeschool parents to be able to have that time to focus one on one and to be able to allow our child to move. I know my kids moved a lot when they were learning, and it's just the way they wanted to be, and so
Well, and I think that as you get older and you become an adult, you don't need to move as much. And so in our adult brains, we're thinking, oh, for my child to learn, they need to be like sitting
yeah.
and listening. And
Mm,
we just have it in our brains that that's how kids should behave when they're learning. But
right.
I'm a huge proponent of shifting that whole mindset and realizing, no, often kids learn way better when they're moving. Whether
Mhm.
in my book, the movement relates directly to the letters, but even if you're not doing a movement that's specific to the learning, it
Yeah.
still helps. Even if they're like
Just
doing
fidgeting
jumping
or
jacks.
something too?
Sorry, what did you say?
Even just fidgeting?
Yeah,
Like,
even
yeah,
fidgeting.
moving their hands?
Yeah,
Mhm.
which I know drives so many parents crazy, and they're like, "Stop fidgeting, stop
Right.
moving." Um, but it actually helps their brain. And so
Hmm.
if parents can kind of change their mindset and realize that they're fidgeting because they need to, like,
Right.
and it actually makes their brain function better.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So,
We got a couple people on live. I know one viewer just said that she decided to homeschool her son's now 15, will be 16 February, gets his high school diploma in January. Well, congratulations. We're talking about reading today. So if any of you have questions about teaching reading or helping your child who is struggling in reading, we'd love to be able to answer those questions too while we are live. So definitely join in on the conversation. So yes, we are live and would love to make you part of the conversation. So, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it is hard as an adult who learns very differently and has able to focus and concentrate longer because kids just can't. Their concentration periods are so short. So being able to have those a curriculum that helps us to change our mindset as well is just genius. So, because otherwise, I found myself a lot of times trying to, like, in the spur of the moment, come up with something that I could do that would keep a child, focused and on topic. And it never turns out very good. Some good ideas, but it's nice to have somebody who's like pre-thought that out and kind of, knows, back to what you were talking about earlier, those steps. There's just those complicated steps in learning to read, and to think through that much more diligently and systematically. So, I think as we talk about this, a lot of parents, they feel overwhelmed or discouraged because they feel like, I've done this for so long. I don't even know if this is, what to do next. Do you have any advice for those that are just feeling frustrated or defeated in the process?
Yes, absolutely. Because I think a lot of parents feel frustrated when they're trying to teach their child to read, either because their child's not progressing as quickly as they think they should, or
Yes.
their child is frustrated and just doesn't want to do it anymore. There's a lot of reasons to be frustrated. So yes, I totally get it. It's totally normal. So my advice to parents is, if you are frustrated, to just take a step back, to stop whatever it is you're doing, and to reassess, and to really think about your child's individual needs and the way that they learn the best. Because often it's so hard to find a curriculum, there's so many options, and a lot of times parents are like, well, I just spent hundreds of dollars on this, so we're going to do it. And so you stick with it.
To the demise of you and your child.
Yes,
unfortunately.
Exactly. So I always suggest that parents really try to understand their child and come to where their child is, instead of expecting their child to come to them, if that makes sense.
Great advice.
So, for example, think about their child and their strengths and what they love to do. So, like, even if you're adding in movement, add in movement in a way your child likes it. Like, if your child loves to dance, figure out a way to incorporate that into learning to read, which you might think that sounds crazy, but I promise it'll probably work.
Yeah.
Or, if your child loves sports, on our website, we have tons of these sensory games and activity ideas, but you can incorporate these things like, okay, if your child is tired of practicing phonics and they're not getting it, but they love soccer, okay, well then put flashcards on cones and have them kick the soccer ball to kick it over. And then, when they get it, they have to say that sound. Incorporating ways that things your child likes and ways that they learn. So yeah, when people are frustrated, it's usually because what they're doing is not working and not a good fit. So it's time to reassess and think of, or just come up with a new game plan. The other thing is, often if the child is frustrated, I always suggest going back 2 steps, because maybe their foundation isn't strong enough. And so if they don't really have a solid grasp of all the letter sounds, and then you're moving on to long vowels or, really hard words, and they don't really understand the basics, they're going to be frustrated and not going to want to do it. And then you're going to be frustrated.
Right. Yeah.
So I always suggest making sure the foundation is really, really strong before moving on.
Yeah, I did that with one of my children when I found was really, really struggling, because when we did go back, then all of a sudden the successes started like piling up, and he was feeling better about himself and not so down on his inabilities because he was seeing the gaps. So I love that suggestion because it really does work.
Yeah, like my oldest, when she could read finally, she wanted to read all these books that I thought were too babyish for her. And in my ignorance, I kept trying to push her to read harder and harder things, and she didn't like those books and didn't want to. And now that I'm much older and wiser, I understand it's because she was still working on those skills at that level. Like I thought she should be
Right.
ahead of that. Um, but no, like you can like if your kid really wants to read certain books, like let them read it. Like that's
Yeah.
probably skills they're still working on and they're confident, like they know they can read that book, so they want to read that book. Whereas
That
where when
makes so
you're
much sense.
pushing them to read harder things, they don't want to do it because it's actually still too hard for them.
Right. Yeah. And there's always time. There's always time. And we can always do read out louds if they're not reading it, or companion reading, so many other things that I've done with my
Absolutely.
kids. We've got a question from a viewer. Jennifer had asked, where do things like IQ come into play? My two oldest children who are adopted have IQs of 56 and 72 with intellectual disabilities. And she said, I worry about our relationship over time to keep teaching reading when I wonder if they'll fully ever get it.
If you're worried about your relationship, meaning like because you're getting frustrated and like upset with them type of thing. So to that, I always say your relationship always matters more. Like
Absolutely.
don't
Over anything.
yeah, like don't hurt your relationship because you're so worried about them learning to read. Um, this is sort of unrelated, but that happened with me and my daughter when she was in 3rd grade and like over homework and like stuff. And it was starting to ruin our relationship. It was becoming a battle.
Yeah,
I was like, I'm done. Like, I'm not ruining my relationship with her over getting homework done, you know?
exactly.
Um, so my first piece of advice, there's definitely that, like, do whatever you can to keep a strong relationship because that matters the most.
Yeah.
And then the whole thing with them ever being able to learn to read. I mean, I don't know your specific children and what their needs and challenges are. Um, but I wouldn't give up hope. I mean, I
Yeah.
think maybe they won't be at, reading college textbooks, but, they might progress as well as they can, and you can be proud of
Yeah.
those moments. And I would definitely, if you've tried a lot of different things, I would definitely give the adding movement a try.
Hmm.
I've heard a lot of success stories from parents of kids with disabilities that this has kind of been the thing that finally clicked for them and worked. So I wouldn't give up hope yet. Um, yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It is hard. And especially with the adopted kids, because you have, there's probably trauma. There's probably a whole lot of other things. I have 10 adopted siblings, so I
Wow.
completely get that. And so there's a lot of rebuilding. There's a lot of trust that needs to be established, and use those. My suggestion is use that time to read as a bonding time rather than a dividing time. And whether that means that you do a lot of it and you just point at the words, instead of the child always feeling like they're on the spot. And I think when my oldest didn't learn to read till he was 12, and my goal in the back of my mind was I want him to love literature. And so that was my goal, was to just pour into him literature. And at age 12, he started reading, because he had the excitement for it and he wanted to actually do it. And so then he started just really, you know, reading. It just took him. He's a very frustrating child, but there was still as an adult, kind of the same way. But yeah, she said to clarify they're 18 and 16. So yes, but you never. The truth is, we never stop learning, though. The brain has plasticity.
That's
So
true. It's true. So yeah, I would say if you haven't tried the adding movement, which
mhm.
I would say give that a go and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. We had another viewer asking about a segment on math. We've done a couple episodes on math recently, so you may want to check back on our YouTube channel or on our podcast. And I'm sure there'll be other episodes coming up too. So we we talk about reading and math a lot because I know those are things you guys all struggle with, and many other parents too. So yes, definitely. So check that out. So what are some tips for this keeping learning to read fun and engaging? I know we talked a little bit about just making it more hands-on and using movement. I loved your idea about the soccer and the soccer ball. My son loves shooting things with Nerf guns, so we definitely incorporated that into a lot of his schoolwork.
Yeah, I love that.
So
yeah, anything like that, like doing crafts, doing sensory activities, going outside, doing games. I mean, there's a billion things you can do. Like I said, our website, we offer tons of letter learning all these kinds of ideas. Because the point is, you don't want it to feel like they're learning. It's not like, sit down, we're going to have this lesson. It's, hey, let's play this fun game and we're going to practice our letter sounds while we do it.
right.
The kids, excuse me, often don't even realize, like, they just think they're having fun and playing a game.
Yeah.
So I think anything you can do to make it more fun and interesting, get them moving, get them, painting, making a craft, whatever it is. All these things, again, access different parts of their brain, and it gets them learning in different ways, which again builds those different neural pathways and helps them learn and retain it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we as parents just have to get beyond the fact that we think that those things are extras
Yeah.
instead of the way to open up the learning that is happening. And that's probably a bigger hurdle sometimes than just, changing the lesson plan.
Well, yeah, because it's tiring. It takes a little. As parents, we just want to sit.
Right.
So sometimes you got to match your kids' energy.
Absolutely. That is hard, and it's hard to
But
maintain
but
that.
again, it doesn't have to be anything like big or crazy or overwhelming. Like, a lot of the ideas we
Yeah.
put on our website are just like super simple that anyone can do without any prep. Like, I have 5 kids. I get it. Like, you don't want to spend hours prepping for something. It's got to be stuff
Right.
that's just really easy and ready to go.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think once we start to change that mindset and we have some help in doing that, and with the resources like you create, and it over time it makes that shift easier to move into. And but it's a shift in how we've been taught. Most of us have been taught to read through auditory and in visual ways. And so when we start adding all these more multisensory approaches, it just seems very awkward, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to us why we should do all these extra things. But I
Right.
think, like you said, when you start to see the results and that they stick so much quicker,
Mhm.
that I hope parents, as you do that, it will encourage you then to continue, because I know I just remember watching, like, the whole demeanor of my children change when we did more hands-on activities versus just sitting and reading from a book, because
Yeah,
my kids were all very active learners. So,
absolutely.
yeah. So how can we build children's confidence if they don't feel confident? If they've been learning, whether in a school setting or we've been using a much more rigid approach to teaching, and they kind of feel defeated. What are the best ways to start working them towards feeling like reading is something they can still approach instead of, I'm done with this?
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, I think it's about going back to the basics and that foundation. Like, find, like, kind of that sweet spot where they do feel confident, whether that's reading Bob books or level 2 books or whatever, find where
Mhm.
find something they can read where they are confident and go back to that spot and stay there for a while to kind of rebuild
Got
that
it.
confidence. One of my biggest pet peeves about the publishing world is the issue is a lot of the early readers are just way too hard for kids to read.
Really?
Yeah, and every publisher has a different system. So it's not like you can go pick up a book that says level 1 and it's going to be
Yes.
where your
Oh,
kid
I
is.
noticed that years ago.
Yeah,
Yes.
because every publisher does their levels differently, and so it doesn't actually really mean anything. And
Yeah.
often those level 1 books are they're just way too hard. They're really for like a second grader, like a 7 or
Mm.
8-year-old. They're
Wow.
not, you know, and so that can be really crushing to a kid when you're like, well, this book says it's for a 5 to 8-year-old and you're 6. You should be able to read it. Like that,
Right. Hmm.
it doesn't mean anything really. Um, and so you have to really be careful about finding books that is actually at your child's level. Um, so that's one thing. And then also just like celebrating the small things and giving a lot of praise, and kind of trying to relieve that pressure from your child. Because I
Right.
think kids do
Yeah.
feel a lot of pressure about learning to read because really it's like the most important academic thing they need to learn. Um,
Yeah.
and so
And
if
they're
they
surrounded by opportunities or group settings where they're kind of put on the spot. I know
right.
I even noticed that in my studio. A lot of the girls, talk with each other and they're like, "Can you write?" And I have one that has severe dyslexia who often will come, quietly to me and
Mhm.
say, "Can you write this for me? Can you read this for me?" And even I'm in a group of peers that really do accept her and they would never judge her, but she just feels that way. And so it's
Yeah,
it's
there's
hard.
definitely a lot of social pressure around reading, especially if a kid is asked to read out loud and they don't feel confident in it. It can be really embarrassing. Um, and so just being aware of that and kind of being
Yeah,
patient and like reinforcing to your child that you're going to get there. You're going to learn how to read. It's okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
Sometimes it takes a little bit longer for some kids, and that's okay. Um, so I think doing that can be a big help too.
Yeah. I think sharing as they get older too, you shared a statistic that 60% of kids struggle to read. Um, I think if they knew that they were in the majority, that would
Yeah.
be helpful, especially as they get older. And you're not alone. This is something a lot of people struggle with. And yeah, do just instead of thinking I'm the only one out there, just to know that there's they, there.
They're not alone. It is very
Yes,
true.
exactly. I had one parent said that they read a lot of magazines, circulars, smaller stories, and that can give you content then
Mhm.
at interest levels, especially as kids get older. I know some of those earlier to read books have content for younger people, or um, maybe they can read to a younger sibling, and so they aren't feeling like they're reading the book for themselves,
Right.
but maybe just yeah. So there's lots of great things out there.
Yeah.
Uh, and then, yeah, parents saying like, "I have dyslexia, and I'm teaching a child with dyslexia." That is really common. It does run in families. I'm not sure if it's genetic or how that, um, if there's enough research out to say much about that. But I do know that if one parent struggles, it's usually pretty typical that one or more children um, will struggle too.
Yeah. And with dyslexia, like you really have to learn to read in a totally different way. And so that's just a whole nother challenge for sure.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So, yes. So so what about, like, encouraging, like, literacy and a reading-friendly home? 'Cause, we may have some viewers whose children do well with reading, or they just don't feel like they get enough time to get, enough like extra reading time in? And so what might be some ways that parents can go about to just make sure that they don't, they don't just do the textbooks, that they actually get good literature in as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, I think everyone knows like reading to your child tonight at night is before bedtime
Oh,
is,
yeah.
always a great thing. But I think a lot of parents feel like they only need to read to their kids before bed when they're little. Um, but research actually shows there's huge benefits of continuing to read to your children out loud until they're older, like even middle school. I mean, you can keep
Wow.
reading
Yeah.
novels to them. It does wonders for your children. I mean, just bonding, but also helping them with their academics. There's a lot of benefits to things like that. So I always recommend that. Continue reading to your children, even when you don't. Okay, I guess it's a lot of parents stop reading to their kids once their kids can read on their own. But that just because your
Yes.
kids can read on their own doesn't mean you should stop reading to them.
Yeah.
So I always recommend continuing to read. For kids learning to read, older siblings can be a great resource,
Hmm.
or even a younger sibling, actually. So if you have like a 6 or 7 year old learning to read, one way to build confidence in them is to often ask them to read to the younger sibling, which can, maybe they're reading easier books, and helping, or, hey, why don't you practice letter sounds with your younger sibling? And, those kinds of things can involve the whole family and help build confidence. Um,
Right.
and then, just having a lot of books in your home, go to the library a lot.
Yeah.
Audiobooks are wonderful. For a lot of kids that struggle to read, audiobooks are a great resource.
Absolutely.
Whether you're listening in the car or at home or whatever, some kids just really thrive on the audiobooks. So,
Yeah. Yeah, those all build into habits
mhm.
too. As the more that you do them, they just become a way of how your family operates. And I remember making those shifts when my kids were younger and going, this is so difficult. But then all of a sudden it's like we woke up one morning and they're like, okay, when are we going to do this? And it was just expected, that, and it was like, oh my goodness, this is such a relief now that we got through the hardest. It's like teaching your kids how to do chores. It's never easy when you're in the process of it, but when they get it, then it makes life so much easier.
So true. It's so true.
Yeah, and then they move it into adulthood. I know we're headed out on a family vacation, and the kids are already, my adult children are asking, which books are we going to listen to in the car?"
I love that.
So yes, it will perpetuate itself, and so you have to think of what you're building long term as well. So yeah.
It's very true.
So for parents beginning the journey, maybe they don't even know, like what they're going to do, what their child is, what should they be looking for in a reading program that would help them to be able to teach much more efficiently.
Well, you definitely want a program that teaches phonics. So if people don't know what that means, it basically means uh, understanding that each letter makes a sound. Because when you learn to read, like each letter has a name, but the sound it makes is different than the name. So, for example, the alphabet song that we sing, you're singing the letter names, and
Yes.
parents are very focused on that and concerned. Oh, my kid needs to know all the letter names, which is great and all, but knowing letter names doesn't actually help a child learn to read. Um, so I always recommend make sure you're teaching the letter sounds, even from babyhood. Alphabet books, you can teach, oh, this is the A, it says ah, the B says B, and really reinforcing that
Right.
will really help with early reading skills because it's the sounds that they need to know to learn to read. So looking for a reading program, definitely something focused on phonics. All the research shows that that is the best way to teach children to read. Our country moved away from phonics for a while, and it was pretty much a disaster.
Yeah.
So definitely that. And then look for something that fits your child's learning style. If your child is a visual learner, then a traditional learn to read book might work really well for them. If your child has, some disabilities or learning challenges or just can't sit still, you're going to want to look for something that incorporates movement and makes it easy for them to learn in other ways with that whole multisensory aspect.
Absolutely. And I'm going to put a plug in for your resources too. Stefanie, if you're watching on YouTube, that link is already in the show notes. But if you go to Linktree /Stefanie Hohl, you can also find her there. And that link will be in all the show notes too. So for the podcast and everything. So, but then you can find out more about her program, ABCC Here Do. So that we'll incorporate all those things, I'm certain. So I would love to, we've been talking about teaching kids with disabilities to read too. And I know that is a much more long-term process for kids that really, really struggle. How can a parent long-term just continually work at building confidence for a student who is going to be in this for a lot longer than a typical child?
Yeah, I think just taking it in small chunks every day, even if you're like, we're just going to work on this a minute a day. And we're just going to work on, practicing the letter sounds, or we're just going to work on reading 3 words a day and blending them together. Doing whatever you can do, even if it's 1 minute a day, over time, that builds up and eventually it's going to stick and they're going to get it. And just kind of having that long view, like, okay, maybe it's going to take my child an extra 5 years to learn to read, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's finding what they're interested in, what they like, what they can do. And just, I think, being patient in that and letting them learn at the pace that's right for them. There's
great advice. Yeah.
I think a lot of us have it in our mind that our kids have to read by a certain age, but why?
Right. Exactly. That's a very good question. Why?
Some kids are going to read when they're 4. Some kids aren't going to read till they're 12 or 16 or whatever, because each child is so unique and different and has their own learning challenges, that I think it's important to not freak out as a parent. Like, if your child's not doing things exactly when they're supposed to be doing them, because every child is so different and unique.
Absolutely. And yes, and taking it at the child's pace and really breaking it down, like you were just talking about, it's so important, because as a parent, I think when you spend time teaching your kids and homeschooling, when they're about to lose it. And you've got to cut it off before then. Otherwise, the whole rest of the day is just going to be awful. But I think we often push that envelope because we're like, well, this is in the lesson plan. We're supposed to get this done. But to just be okay with, well, we're going to hit that breaking point soon. Now is the time to stop. I'm just going to put a marker right here where we're at, and we will pick this up next time. And I think that's great advice, because that also will go back to what we were talking about earlier, and not ruining those relationships. And it will not create learners who feel so defeated, which we've also talked about in this conversation, to the point where they're shut down. And I know a lot of parents who have very shut down learners because they've been pushed so much. So
exactly. Yeah. And if they are shut down, then it's time to take a break from that and approach it from a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And sometimes that just means that you have to take a break from the instruction and find that stories are fun, and that yes, you take those steps back like you talked about earlier. I love that suggestion, is going further back so that they can have a lot of successes in that. So
Yeah.
um,
There's also so many different types of books and literature that I also think a lot of times kids say they don't like reading, but that really just means they don't like reading this one type of specific book that they've been
absolutely.
given the
Yeah.
opportunity. Because, there's a lot of kids really prefer nonfiction. And if a parent loves fiction, they often don't think of offering that as an option, right? But
Right.
there's fiction, there's nonfiction, there's graphic novels, there's novels in verse, there's just a plethora of options out there. So I think that's another thing, is finding the books that really speak to your child. Like
Absolutely.
my husband only reads nonfiction, and I read a little nonfiction, but I love fiction more. And it's not fair if you only offer a child fiction and they're just not that into it, for them to say,
Right.
"Oh, I don't like reading." And it's like, well, maybe you do
Yeah.
like reading, you just haven't found the books that you really connect with. Um, so obviously that comes after the whole learning to read process, but I think it's important for parents, especially homeschoolers, to remember, like, oh, there's this wide world out there. And if my kid is saying, I hate reading, then it's like, okay, let's find a different book for you.
Absolutely. That's such good advice. There's, and I wouldn't be the one to recommend poetry, but some people like that too. And but yeah, and so yeah, your child's going to approach that uniquely, and why not with something that they really want to engage with. Great
Mhm.
advice. So as we're wrapping up, do you have any final words, encouragement, things for our audience?
Um, Again, just to remember that um, your child will be okay. They will learn to read. um, Try to not get frustrated. And if you are, to just try something else and keep on going. And
Absolutely.
that you're not alone. All of us, so many parents out there struggle with this, and so many kids struggle with it, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Um, there are other ways to teach them and other ways to learn, and we just have to figure out what those ways are.
Yes, so true. Yep. And for some, it's very short. I remember my youngest taught herself to read before I even opened a book.
Mhm.
And, my oldest didn't read till 12, and it had nothing to do with me.
Yep, it's
It's
absolutely
they each have their own tracks, and you just got to be okay with the process. And I want to thank you for this last hour. I think you just really spoke into that it's just going to be a journey, and we have to let our child lead, and we need to follow and use materials and resources that are going to help them to learn the way they need to learn, and read when they learn to read.
right.
It's just, yeah. Well, thank you, Stefanie. And Stefanie's got some great resources and curriculum as well, reading curriculum. You can check out all of those things at her link tree. It's Stefanie Hohl. And that link will be in the show notes too, so you can find her and all those resources there. And like I told her before we started the show, I said I'm impressed that she's written this, because I'm not. I mean, I've written one book and it was kind of a mess, but I yeah, that is not in me to do that. So I'm always impressed with people that can put all of their thoughts and methods into writing, and just thankful for people like you that provide resources for our families that really need them. And so thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm just really passionate about helping parents help their kids learn to read. So this has been wonderful being here today.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, and thank you all for joining us today on the show. Next week, it's going to be Thanksgiving week. So we have pre-recorded a conversation with me and the other co-hosts of Empowering Homeschool Conversations. We're going to be talking about advocating for your child, navigating co-ops, field trips, and public spaces on your homeschool path. And we have a very interesting conversation. Let's just put it that way. So you'll want to stay tuned because we've all had different experiences in those, and so we'll share those with you and some of the wisdom that we've gained from that. So thank you again, Stefanie, and thank you all for joining us today on the show. And we'll see you here again next week on Empowering Homeschool Conversations. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
This has been Empowering Homeschool Conversations, provided by SPED Homeschool, a nonprofit that empowers families to home educate diverse learners. To learn more, visit spedhomeschool.com